Hi there, welcome to Pithy Polemics. We're a group of friends who are interested in discussing topics in philosophy, theology, history, fantasy, and more. My name is James Liang. I'm a part-time seminary student who's interested in philosophy, theology, and apologetics. In this channel, I'm going to summarize books I'm reading at the moment and provide my preliminary thoughts on them. My hope is to get interested listeners up to speed on the topics we discuss and provide a forum for sharing and discussing our thoughts. This is the second video in a chapter-by-chapter series on Brian Davies' book, The Thought of Thomas Aquinas, which provides an overview of Aquinas' positions on a number of theological issues. In this video, I'll be discussing Chapter 2 of the book, Getting to God, which focuses on Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. Davies starts off the chapter by explaining Aquinas' background assumptions about the need to prove God's existence. He says that in one sense, Aquinas didn't really care about proving God's existence because he himself didn't doubt the reality of God, he didn't know any atheists in the modern sense of the term, and he didn't think he could force anyone to believe in God. For the most part, he agreed with Anselm's motto of faith-seeking understanding, and Augustine's motto of believe that you may understand, meaning that he takes faith and belief in God for granted because they are prerequisites for understanding deeper truths about reality. Yet, in another sense, he took formulating arguments for God's existence very seriously and firmly believed that any reasonable, unbiased person would come to believe in God on the basis of rational arguments. Arguments Aquinas believed rose to the level of logical proofs. Before actually going into Aquinas' arguments for God, Davies provides a nice summary of how he doesn't think you can prove God. He thought that there was no contradiction in saying that God doesn't exist, because his existence is not self-evident the way that 2 + 2 = 4 is. Whereas some have held that everyone believes in God deep down because everyone believes in truth and God is truth, Aquinas held that although everyone believes in truth, it's not self-evident that there's a first truth from which all other truths derive. Whereas Augustine held that no one can arrive at any truth without special assistance from God, Aquinas held that humans are built with an intellect that can get at truth without outside help. However, he rejected attempts at direct proofs like Anselm's ontological argument, which tries to argue that God's existence is necessary from the very concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, because he didn't think humans could grasp God's nature in a robust enough way that would allow us to conclude his existence by definition. Lastly, he rejected the idea that we all have some innate awareness of God's existence, which some have argued for using Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from his workmanship, so that men are without excuse. Rather, he wants to show that God exists from the things we can perceive with our senses in the physical world, and argue from effect to cause. In this way, he interprets Paul as saying in Romans 1 that we all have the ability and the potential to discover God's existence through his creation, making evident what was not explicitly or immediately evident to us before. This is exactly his strategy and his goal in his arguments for God's existence. Having laid the groundwork of where Aquinas was coming from, Davies now dives into his 5 ways. Davies notes that these arguments are not original to Aquinas. Versions of them were raised by Aristotle, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, and Islamic thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes. The second point is that Aquinas didn't intend these arguments to show every attribute traditionally ascribed to God, but gradually builds a case revealing more and more of these attributes with each additional argument. So it's not a fair critique to say, you haven't proved God, what about this or that attribute? Davies' last preliminary point is that Aquinas' 5 ways make inferences based on causation, and so we need to understand which kind of causation Aquinas has in mind when he's making these arguments. One kind of causation is chronological causation, which deals with some event in the present occurring as a result of some prerequisite event in the past. Davies gives the example of our grandparents being a kind of chronological cause of our being born, in that without them, our parents wouldn't have been born, but they didn't directly cause our births in any way. This is not the kind of causation at work in Aquinas' 5 ways. Rather, he thought of God as a sustaining cause, much like how a column might be the sustaining cause of a statue by preventing it from toppling over. Aquinas' strategy, then, is to pick out some features of our common experience that he argues require a sustaining cause, and discover some attribute of that cause based on the properties of the feature under examination. The first way is the argument from motion. We observe that in our world, things are constantly changing and in motion. But what does it mean for something to undergo change? It means that something is now what it was not before. Whatever produced that change couldn't come from within the thing itself before it was changed, or else it would already be that thing and wouldn't need to change from a prior state. And he says that something can't actualize its own potential, or else it would already be actual, not potential. So whatever produces a change and actualizes something's potential must already be actual and external to the thing being changed. But that external cause itself undergoes change, and therefore requires an external cause for its change. So what you have here is a system of chains of causes producing change and actualizing potential in other things. But the chain of causes can't go back infinitely, since that would be absurd. Think of a row of dominoes falling over one by one, each caused by the domino before it. You can't have an infinite number of dominoes, because at some point, someone had to have pushed the first domino in the series. So, Aquinas reasons, there must be a first cause that is the ultimate source of all the change in the world, and that itself does not change, a being with pure actuality and no potentiality, an unchanged changer or an unmoved mover. This is what we mean by God. The second way is the argument from efficient cause, and follows a similar line of reasoning to the first way. In our everyday experience, we find that things don't come into existence for no reason. Something always causes things to begin to exist. But for whatever cause you can think of for something's coming into being, you can always ask, what caused that to exist? Once again, you can't have an infinite chain of causes, and the buck has to stop somewhere. In this case, we arrive at an original cause that is not itself caused by anything, an uncaused first cause. The third way is the argument from contingency. When we look at the things in our universe, we get the sense that these are things that didn't have to exist. Their existence is contingent. Virtually everything we know of, rocks, trees, tables, chairs, these things didn't have to exist. And if something didn't have to exist, then there should be an explanation for why it exists in the first place. But if you explain the existence of a contingent thing with another contingent thing, then you have to ask yourself why that thing exists rather than not. Just like with the first two arguments, you can't have an infinite series of contingent things causing one another, so the chain has to stop somewhere. The answer, according to Aquinas, is that there must be something that exists by necessity, that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. The fourth way is the argument from gradation. Aquinas observes that there are degrees of perfections in things. For example, a human being has more perfections than a dog, who has more perfections than a lizard, who has more perfections than a cockroach. Citing Aristotle's example of things getting hotter the closer they are to a fire, Aquinas argued that everything obtains its perfections from an ultimate source of maximal perfection, namely God. The fifth way is the argument from design. When Aquinas looks at nature, he sees that even things without intelligence behave in a way that seem goal-directed or aimed at some end. For example, trees grow, branch out, produce fruit for people to eat, make flowers for people to enjoy, and provide shade from the heat. However, says Aquinas, inanimate objects can't move towards a goal unless directed to do so by some outside intelligence. Therefore, everything in nature must be directed to act the way they do because they were designed that way by a grand designer. These five arguments together lead us to an unmoved mover and an uncaused first cause, who exists of necessity, is maximally perfect, and is responsible for nature's design. Now, there's another argument that Aquinas references in many of his works called the existence argument. This argument says that because existence is common to all things that exist, there must be a single source from which all existing things obtain their existence. Aquinas' reasoning goes like this. When you think of a dog, you can imagine its essence in your mind. Hairy, four-legged, mammalian, etc. But you can never derive the actual existence of a dog from its definition, or essence. Just like a drawing in the artist's mind isn't real until the artist puts pencil to paper, something external to the essence of a dog needs to breathe life into it in order to bring it into existence. But only things that already exist can cause something else to begin to exist. And again, since there can't be an infinite regress of existing things, there must be an eternally and necessarily existent thing, a being whose very essence just is existence, who cannot help but exist by its very nature and from whom all other things derive their existence. This is the basis of the Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity. God is ipsum esse subsistens, the act of existence itself, with no composition of parts, no real distinctions, and no real relations. From the highly metaphysical notion of existence just described, we can derive two further conclusions. The first is that by creation, we're not talking about taking pre-existing matter and rearranging it the way a sculptor does. The power to create means to bring something from a state of non-existence, that is to say, nothingness, to a state of being, power that is unique to God. The second conclusion is that God doesn't just get the ball rolling and watch it from afar. Because all existence derives from a single being, things must continually be sustained by the life-giving power of that being, or else they would immediately fade out of existence. This is the doctrine of continuous preservation. The last section of the chapter focuses on the fact that unlike some cosmological arguments, Aquinas' arguments don't rely on the universe having a beginning. They don't argue that there's a linear or horizontal series of causes or events, but a vertical hierarchy. Indeed, Aquinas himself didn't think you can demonstrate philosophically that the universe began to exist, and took it as an article of faith based on the testimony of the Bible. He says that the essences of things are timeless, and therefore do not include any relationship with time, including that of the universe. Therefore, there's nothing in the definition of the universe that necessitates its having a beginning. Nor does he find philosophical arguments for a finite past persuasive. Responding to the argument that something's being made implies that it began in its duration, Aquinas says that it's possible the universe didn't begin to exist in some clockable first moment of time, and was made instantaneously rather than successively. He's also not convinced by arguments that attempt to show the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite, because he says there's always a finite amount of time between 2 points, and so he thinks that there's no contradiction in an infinite past. Ultimately, Aquinas thinks that his first cause arguments work regardless of one's view on whether the universe had a beginning, because he envisions the world as one big object that is dependent on God at all times. So that's it for the chapter summary. Now it's time for my evaluation. I won't really be commenting on how Davies presents Aquinas' positions and arguments, as I haven't actually read Aquinas myself and don't know the primary literature all that well, so I'll just be interacting with Aquinas' positions and arguments themselves as explained by Davies. Let's start with the points I agree with. I agree with his view that you can't really force anyone to believe in God, but that there exist good arguments for God's existence that should be convincing to the average person. I also appreciate that he didn't think faith needed to be based on such arguments, as I know many devout Christians who believe on the basis of religious experiences they've had, or just the inner witness of the Holy Spirit providing peace and assurance of God's love for them. Yet at the same time, he took the crafting of his philosophical arguments very seriously, thought deeply about them, read extensively from many sources, and addressed counter-arguments in his writing. I think Aquinas is right that God's existence is not immediately obvious, at least according to most people I know, and it's not the case that deep down everyone believes in God. Perhaps more controversially, I also agree with Aquinas that the reformed Augustinian thought about sin inhibiting our ability to know things is overwrought, and that God has provided us with the cognitive faculties to be able to make informed decisions about his existence and whether or not to place our faith in him. I think his assessment that we can start from creation and reason our way to God is absolutely spot on, and I admire him for being one of the first champions of the classical apologetic method, which I fully endorse. His second and third ways, in my opinion, are very solid and find expression in contemporary cosmological arguments, and so I fully agree with them. Now for my criticisms. Without sugarcoating it too much, I'm not a big fan of Aquinas' arguments that presuppose an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, which I don't hold to, and I think lead to some really bizarre and philosophically and theologically unacceptable conclusions. For example, the first way looks at change in motion from the lens of actualization of potential by an external agent, but I think there are some serious issues with this account of change. For one thing, it seems to me that free agents have the power to cause change of their own accord, which is to say that everyone is a first mover in a way. When I lift my hand, I'm hard-pressed to think of what external cause is making me do this. I am the sole initiator of this change because nothing caused me to act of my own free volition. Once you accept that a first mover could be a being composed of act and potency, as I am, you no longer have any motivation for viewing God as pure act, which I think is an unbiblical doctrine anyway. If God were pure act, then this means that he has no potential. All of his potential is necessarily actualized. Yet it seems like God has the potential to do a lot of things. Take, for example, creation. Surely it's possible for God to have created a different universe, or to create another universe right now, or to refrain from creation altogether. It seems like the only way to escape this intuition is for the Thomists to say that this is the only possible universe that could have existed, which I think most of us would find absurd. I think a similar problem exists for the existence argument, which presupposes a real essence-existence distinction. Why think that there are real essences of things, and that these things are transported from the realm of non-being to being by the infusion of this magical life juice called existence? Why not say, as modern analytic philosophers do, that something either exists or doesn't exist, and we can analyze that thing by the properties it instantiates? Furthermore, the conclusion of the existence argument that God must be absolutely simple in the Thomistic sense leads, I think, to a conception of God that is unintelligible. According to the doctrine of divine simplicity, God's properties are identical to one another, and God doesn't have any accidental properties. I have no idea what it means for omniscience and omnipotence to be identical properties, and although Thomists would respond that these are true analogical rather than univocal predications that we make of God, there has to be something in virtue of which these predications are true, and on Thomism, I have no idea what that would be. An even bigger problem for me is that if God doesn't have any accidental properties, then God doesn't stand in any real relations to things, even while he creates, knows, loves, and interacts with his creatures. This is a circle I genuinely have no idea how you can square. Next, the fourth way presupposes the notion of degrees of perfection, which I admittedly find unintelligible. What counts as a perfection, and how do you determine what has a higher or lower degree of it? It seems to me that what people understand as perfections can be articulated in terms of specific properties like power, knowledge, moral goodness. But once you make this clarification, it's not clear to me how you can make the next move that all of these things ultimately derive from a source of maximal power, knowledge, and moral goodness. Aquinas appeals to the Aristotelian notion of things being warmer the closer they are to a fire, but this is clearly an outdated way of thinking about the sharing of properties. I mean, think about how strange it sounds to say that there are different degrees of blueness that we observe in things, so therefore there must be a source of maximal blueness from which the blueness in all blue things derive. Maybe there's a way to modernize this argument with appeal to some other metaphysical principle, but I just don't see it. Lastly, the fifth way is a design argument, but with a clear Aristotelian flavor in its appeal to final causation. There are some design arguments that I think are good arguments for God, like the fine-tuning argument, but I find the ones based on biological design to be pretty unhelpful in light of neo-Darwinian explanations for the appearance of design and complexity in living organisms. I'm not saying I necessarily buy into the whole naturalistic evolutionary story, but I just don't think you can point to some biological feature and conclude that God must have designed it when there's a powerful alternative explanation. Even for practicality's sake, as an apologetic, I think we want to distance ourselves as much as possible from Ray Comfort's infamous banana argument, which has been ridiculed into oblivion. So those are my thoughts about Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. Overall, I think Davies does a pretty good job of explaining these arguments at a lay level, and provides some really useful background for which thinkers influenced Aquinas' reasoning and how he thought one can reason to God. Again, I'm not a huge fan of Thomistic philosophy, but I think it's helpful for Christians to be aware of different strands of thought in our intellectual tradition, so we can have a more well-rounded theology and apologetic, and understand and interact with our brothers and sisters who think differently from us. I know that some of the sharpest Christian philosophers today are Thomists, including my seminary professors, all of whom would beat me in a debate. So I don't by any means want to demean Thomism, and I am under no illusion that the arguments I offered against Thomism are decisive and irrefutable. I'm just sharing my honest opinions and opening up an opportunity for dialogue. Next time, I'll be summarizing Chapter 3 of Davies' book, What God Is Not, which expounds upon the doctrine of divine simplicity. I hope you enjoyed this video. If this has been helpful to you, please help us out and like, share, and subscribe. Also make sure to hit that bell button for notifications. If you think I'm onto something or you think I'm dead wrong, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. With that, I'll see you in the next video.